A young woman set poison in the mayor's glass, vengeance burning for the brother she lost. But fate is a cruel dealer of cards. When the glass was struck away, her chance at retribution vanished in the chaos. By dawn, the tyrant returned, not with suspicion, but with a proposal that would change the course of her life. What begins as hatred sharpens into a revelation. That the man she sought to kill may hold the truth, and the future, of the town itself. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you love Wild West stories. She rose each morning before the town stirred, unlocking the doors of the saloon as though unlocking her father's memory, the smell of aged oak and tobacco smoke mingling with the scent of coffee she brewed strong enough to wake the dead, and every gesture of hers carried the quiet weight of someone who had learned far too young that survival meant never leaning on another's hand. Her late 20s had carved her into a figure of sharp contrasts, beauty and ferocity, kindness tempered by steel, a woman whose dress, though simple, clung to her like armor, and whose boots struck the wooden floorboards with the authority of command. The men who passed through respected her not only for her sharp wit and her unflinching stare but also for the way she kept order in a place where whiskey and tempers so often ran hot, and even the bandits who dared swagger in with guns at their hips felt the edge of unease in her presence, for she did not cower, she did not bend, and the memory of her father, the hero who had once stood bloodied but unbroken against a gang of raiders, still seemed to linger in her very stance, like a shadow behind her shoulders. The saloon itself was more than four walls to her. It was a testament, a shrine to sacrifice, every dent in the bar, every scar in the floorboards whispering the story of battles survived and nights endured, and though her mother had been taken early by sickness and her only brother now lay in the cold earth, she carried herself as though the weight of loss had been hammered into resilience, her eyes bright with the fire of someone who had already chosen her path, to guard this place, to guard the memory of the man who had taught her courage, and to give the wandering souls of the frontier a haven where music, whiskey, and laughter could briefly silence the guns outside, yet within her chest, beneath the strength that drew admiration and envy alike, beat a heart that had grown weary from solitude, for while townsfolk praised her bravery and children whispered her name with awe, she returned each night to empty rooms, to the echo of boots that once belonged to her father and brother, and she wondered, in the quiet hours, whether strength was enough to fill the hollow spaces where love and family used to live. But by daybreak she never let the cracks show, stepping into the light with her chin lifted, her smile measured, her eyes steady, because she understood better than most that the frontier did not forgive weakness, and so she played her role with perfection, becoming both the stone and the flame, a woman untouchable yet human, feared yet cherished, and in the eyes of the town, she was not simply the keeper of a saloon, she was the embodiment of endurance, the unyielding spirit of a land that broke men but could not break her. When she was no taller than the bar itself, she had clung to her mother's skirts one fateful night as the doors of the saloon burst open and a pack of bandits came roaring in like wolves, their laughter sharp as blades, their boots stomping against the wood, demanding coin and whiskey with pistols flashing. But her father, broad-shouldered, gray already at the temples, and with eyes that burned steady as coals, had stepped forward without hesitation, his hand hovering near his revolver yet his voice calm as a preacher's, telling the men to take their threats elsewhere, and when they sneered and spat and raised their guns, he moved like thunder splitting the sky, steel drawn, fire exploding in the smoke-filled room, each crack of his revolver burning itself into her memory as one by one the outlaws fell to the floorboards, blood seeping into the wood, until silence settled over the wreckage and her father stood alone, chest heaving, yet unbroken, the savior of his home. She had watched with wide eyes, trembling, yet even then she knew she was seeing something eternal, the measure of a man who refused to yield, who fought not for himself but for his family and his people, and in that smoke and blood she found her first lesson in courage, the lesson that strength was not born of anger but of love, not from the hunger to kill but from the resolve to protect, and that night shaped the marrow of her bones so that in the years to come, long after her mother was gone and her father buried with honor, she could step into his place with fire in her chest. Now, when the rowdy cowboys in her saloon stumbled into violence, their fists swinging and their chairs breaking, she did not flinch, she did not retreat to hide behind hired muscle, for she carried his shadow in her stance, the way she planted her boots firm on the floor, the way she raised her voice over the drunken shouts, words sharp as whiplash yet calm as winter steel, cutting through the chaos until even the drunkest fool faltered beneath her gaze, and when two men came crashing into each other one stormy evening, fists bloody and tempers raw, she strode between them without hesitation, her eyes hard, her voice low, commanding them to stand down or face her wrath, and the brawlers, who could snap a lesser woman in two, staggered back as though struck by an invisible hand, muttering curses but obeying nonetheless, for they had felt in her presence something beyond mere defiance. They had felt the echo of a man who had once stood alone against death itself. In those moments, when the air crackled with tension and silence followed her command, she thought of her father, thought of the smoke and the thunder of gunfire, and though she carried no pistol at her hip, her voice and her gaze were weapons enough, a legacy forged in fire, a reminder that strength was not inherited like coin or land but carved into the soul through blood, memory, and the example of a hero who refused to kneel. The news had come not with the formality of a telegram or the solemn ring of a church bell, but in whispers that carried like smoke through the town, curling into every corner of her saloon until it seemed the walls themselves echoed with the name of her brother, dead by unseen hands. And though no lawman rode forth to declare the truth, the people murmured one story with certainty, that the widowed mayor, a man in his early 40s with power coiled around him like a rattlesnake, had ordered the killing, and those murmurs struck her heart like cold iron. Her brother had not been a saint, no, he had been reckless, temper burning too hot, a gambler with fists that found trouble more often than his mind found reason. But he was blood, the last piece of her family left in a world that had stripped her bare, and to think of him lying in the dirt, breathless and broken, because of the man who lorded over the town like a dark shadow made her stomach twist with fire. She remembered the laughter they once shared. How he teased her with clumsy jokes when she worked long nights, how he called her fierce when she scolded him for his foolish ways, and even though he had a scoundrel's smile and a bandit's charm, he was hers, and losing him left her chest hollow, a cavern echoing with grief that burned into rage. Every glance toward the mayor's mansion on the hill felt like staring into the face of the devil, and though his men claimed it had been an accident, a brawl gone wrong, the people insisted he had ordered it, punishing her brother for debts unpaid or for insolence he could not forgive, and she found herself clutching that rumor as though it were scripture, because grief craves a target, and vengeance offers the illusion of justice. Nights became restless as she sat alone in the saloon after the lamps had been snuffed, her hands wrapped around a glass she never drank, her thoughts circling the same dark trail. If her father's courage still lived in her, then it must be turned toward this tyrant, this widower who wore grief like a cloak yet inflicted it upon others without pause. She wondered at his face, carved by years and loss, wondered if those eyes that held power could ever have known mercy, and the longer she thought of him the more the image of her brother's lifeless body rose to answer, reminding her that mercy had no place here, not when blood demanded blood. And so the seed was planted, bitter and unyielding, that one day she would find her chance, that one day she would pour poison or draw steel or strike in whatever way the moment demanded, because vengeance had become her inheritance, the only family left to her. And though the whispers of the town might shift like sand, her resolve did not, for she carried not only grief but the righteous fury of a sister who could not forgive, a sister who would not forget. By the time the saloon light swung to signal closing, the mayor's reach had already threaded itself into every ledger and prayer, his assessments landing like stones on roofs until gutters bowed, and what had once been municipal care had curdled into a squeeze that left merchants hollow-eyed and counting pennies. Licenses that had always been simple were suddenly taxed, market tolls rose under the pretense of roadworks that never came, and fines appeared as if by fate. Late deliveries, a noisy night, a dusty stoop, each one penciled into a ledger that never forgot a name, and the town learned to fear the rustle of paper as much as the crack of a rifle. Families that once traded neighborly credit for a warm meal found their cupboards thinning as coins were siphoned away into official pockets. A blacksmith who had bent metal for a generation began to refuse work he could not be paid for, and a farmer's wagon was seized for an alleged unpaid toll while his children watched from the porch. The saloon itself bore the bruise of the squeeze, barrels ordered and then denied credit, price hikes that drove the working men to skip a night of music, a sudden inspection that kept the shutters closed and the lamps unlit for days, and the keeper who ran the place felt the slow leak as keenly as any blade. She watched patrons count coins before lifting a glass, watched wives whisper about which bread to buy and which to leave, and felt the same old ache that comes when a town's heart is pressed too long. Rumors wound through alleys and behind counters, bribes paid for leniency, ledgers cooked, men in the mayor's employ who turned when asked to look away, and the result was not a single blow but 1,000 small violences that eroded trust and hardened faces. Resentment did not always roar, it accumulated in silent refusals, in a grocer's wary nod when a customer asked for credit, in a merchant who closed his ledger and sighed instead of smiling, in a stable hand who turned a wagon away because a coin had not been put in the bomb. Those small slights cut deeper than any single gunshot, because they bled the town slowly, convincing people that endurance was betrayal and that survival required measures that might once have seemed unthinkable. The keeper moved among these wounds like a sentinel, hands busy polishing the bar, eyes always half on the door, listening to the quiet confessions of debt and worry. She paid out a bowl of stew here, slipped a few coins there, balanced her own books with a precision that bordered on prayer, and watched the town's brave faces grow thinner as the mayor's pocket grew fuller. In the saloon's low light, men muttered of breaking points and of debts to be paid by hands other than their own, and in that fevered hum the seed of action took root, not the flash of a sudden highway robbery but a slow, patient decision born of need and anger. If law weighed so heavily against the poor, then justice might be taken in other ways. The mayor's grip, tightened a little more each month, carved a path toward a reckoning whispered beneath the rafters, where the saloon's defenders counted not only losses but possibilities, and where a quiet, determined hand began to shape the thought of retribution that would not be satisfied by words alone. Once a place of promise and small mercies, the town had shrunk into a map of absences, where laughter had been replaced by careful counting and the main street lay under a layer of dust as if the sky itself had given up on remembering better days. The blacksmith's hammer rang less often, the grocer kept his ledger closed behind a curtained window, and the schoolhouse bell that used to call children to play now hung silent, while porches gathered more worry than company and shutters stayed halfway drawn against the glare of a sun that had no patience for idle hope. Merchants met in hushed corners and slid notes beneath counters, tradesmen who once spoke freely now lowered their heads and spoke only in numbers, and the rumor of the mayor's levies moved through the market like a chill, quick and quiet, leaving pale faces in its wake. Women who once bartered eggs and smiles now tucked coins into the hems of dresses and walked faster past storefronts, avoiding the eyes of men who judged them for needing credit. Even the dogs in alleys seemed to pace with an anxiety that matched the town's heartbeat. In the saloon, where music used to chase the dust out of corners, conversations had turned to lists, debts, deadlines, worry, and the laughter that had once spilled over the bar like warm whiskey was measured now, rationed, as though joy itself were a commodity to be taxed. People glanced toward the saloon owner with a mixture of expectation and exhaustion. She stood behind her polished oak with the same practiced calm. But the look in her eyes carried the town's tally and its weariness, for she had become an island between the town's needs and its despair, offering respite and a rough kind of counsel while also keeping her own losses folded tight against her chest. Children clustered near her door at noon, whispering about a woman who kept her chin up when the mayor's men took more than was right, and mothers nodded toward the saloon when men muttered of uprisings that would never be spoken of in daylight. Yet even as they looked to her for defiance, she carried her grief like a closed ledger, numbers that could not be balanced, a brother's absence that stained conversations and made certain smiles feel like a betrayal. The town's ugliness was not only in the empty storefronts or the piled bills, it was in the slowing down of kindness. The way favors were counted and repaid in cold coin instead of returned with neighborly grace, and in how gossip turned to accusation, roping reputations into the same net that took livelihoods. Hope lived in small resistances, a loaf of bread slipped to a child, a saloon still left open for a man who could not pay that night, a whispered plan between two farmers about pooling seed for spring. Those small rebellions fed the idea that the town might not be entirely broken, but they also reminded everyone how fragile resistance could be when the law and its purse strings were held by a single unyielding hand. So the saloon owner moved through each day with steady competence, catching broken jokes and broken people, offering tea where she could and sternness when needed, and all the while the dust kept falling, coating the streets and the hopes within them until the town itself waited, hushed, watchful, for a spark to split the hard, dry surface and let something living through. The doors of the saloon swung wide one late afternoon, the fading light cutting long across the floorboards, and in strode the mayor with his entourage, boots striking the planks in practiced rhythm, coats brushed clean of dust though their faces showed the fatigue of men uneasy about where they were. The mayor himself carried a presence that silenced conversation without needing to raise a hand, a tall figure in his early 40s, shoulders squared under a dark coat, silver threads glinting at his temples, his eyes deep set and shadowed by years of loss and authority, yet there was something restless in the way they scanned the room, as if he were searching for more than just the familiar comforts of whiskey and laughter. His men moved behind him with the nervous weight of men forced into places where their welcome was uncertain, eyes darting toward patrons who leaned back in their chairs and measured them with cool, silent contempt, and though the mayor lifted his chin with the composure of power, there was an eagerness in his stride that betrayed purpose not tied to drink. He paused at the bar, fingers brushing across the polished oak, and ordered with a voice that carried authority but not warmth, and though the words were meant for whiskey, his eyes were elsewhere, drawn again and again to the figure behind the bar, the young woman in her late 20s whose presence filled the room with a gravity equal to his own. She stood in her burgundy dress, hair pulled back to reveal the proud line of her jaw, her green eyes meeting his without flinch or deference, and in that clash of gazes an unspoken truth stirred. He was not here for liquor, nor for camaraderie, but for something unnameable that tugged at him with the stubbornness of fate. He stole glances when she busied her hands with bottles, his eyes tracing the shape of strength carved by grief and resilience, his thoughts betraying him even as his mouth pressed a straight line, for admiration had taken root where it had no right. Around him, his men shifted, their unease palpable, whispering among themselves that this place was dangerous ground, that the woman who stood with such defiance had no reason to soften toward their leader. Yet the mayor's expression was that of a man worn by more than politics, by the memory of a wife buried too young and by the lonely nights that followed, and the lines on his weathered face spoke not only of authority but of burden, of a man who had lived longer than his years demanded. Patrons watched with narrowed eyes, sensing tension that ran deeper than commerce, and in the heavy stillness of that moment the saloon became more than a building, it became a stage for something that promised consequence, for she measured him with the suspicion of loss and vengeance, and he, though cloaked in power, measured her with a longing he barely allowed himself to feel, a hunger not for whiskey but for connection, dangerous as fire in a land already brittle with dust. The saloon air had grown thick with silence as the mayor's hand closed around the stem of the crystal glass, the amber liquid inside catching the lamplight like a secret flame, and behind the bar the woman held her breath, every nerve taut, every heartbeat counting down the seconds until her vengeance would finally strike, for in that glass rested the answer to her brother's death, to the weight of grief and fury that had carved itself into her soul, and she could almost see the future stretching before her, a world without his shadow over the town, without his taxes crushing merchants and families, a world where the name of her saloon would no longer tremble under his power. Yet fate, cruel and unyielding, does not bend for grief or justice, and just as the mayor raised the drink to his lips, the heavy crash of bodies split the silence, chairs splintering as two cowboys, drunk and staggering from too much whiskey, tumbled into his table with the force of a storm, fists swinging wild and curses spilling into the air, and the glass was struck from his hand before it could touch his mouth, shattering across the floorboards as the poison whiskey bled into the wood like a life undone. The woman's breath caught, her hands tightening against the bar, for in an instant her carefully laid revenge was gone, replaced by chaos, her chance scattered with the shards that glittered like broken promises at the mayor's feet. The mayor's eyes, dark and furious, snapped toward the fight, his face hardening with the cold precision of a man who did not forgive interruptions, and his men surged forward, dragging the brawlers apart with iron fists. But the mayor himself moved with a speed that carried both authority and rage, seizing one man by the collar and slamming him against the wall, his voice a low thunder that silenced even the rowdiest corners of the room. Patrons shrank back into their chairs, music stilled, and the room held its breath as the mayor delivered his lesson, striking fear into the drunkards with the kind of punishment that was meant as a warning to all who watched. The woman stood frozen, her eyes starting to the spilled whiskey seeping into the floor, the wasted chance that she had dreamed of for nights uncounted, and she felt not only the sting of failure but the sharp twist of guilt, for as the mayor's hand tightened on the troublemaker's shirt and his gaze burned with fury, she realized how close she had come to being the cause of his death, how near she had drawn herself to the edge of a darkness she was not certain she could carry. The shattered glass lay between them like a symbol, jagged and gleaming, and though no one in the room knew the weight of what had been lost, she felt it cut her deeper than any blade, the knowledge that vengeance had been within reach and stolen away in an instant, that fate itself had chosen chaos over retribution, leaving her hollow, trembling, and uncertain of what would come next. The room seemed to shrink as the mayor's fury filled it, the brawlers writhing under his grip while his men dragged them across the floor, and though the cowboys were drunk enough to barely know their own names, they sobered quickly under the weight of his authority, for he did not waste words or gestures but struck with cold precision, his fist finding ribs with practiced aim, his boot pressing into the floor beside one man's head until the boards creaked, his voice a cutting growl that promised ruin if they ever dared bring chaos into his presence again. The saloon patrons watched in silence, some averting their eyes, others staring as though in awe of the merciless efficiency with which he rendered punishment, and when he finally stepped back, his coat swirling with the sharpness of his movement, the two troublemakers were left groaning, broken not by bullets but by humiliation, their faces pressed into the dirt and whiskey-stained wood. The mayor's men herded them outside like stray dogs, shoving them into the night air, while the room remained hushed, every soul present measuring the man before them and what it meant to exist under his rule. He stood in the center of that silence, shoulders rising with controlled breaths, his eyes sweeping across the room until they settled on her, the woman behind the bar whose hands had stilled against the polished oak, her expression unreadable yet her presence undeniable. His gaze lingered longer than it should have, longer than a man with such fury still burning in his veins might allow, and in that moment something flickered between them. Power recognized, yes, but something else, something quieter that he did not speak of and she did not dare acknowledge. He turned at last, his boots striking hard against the floor, the swing of his coat like a shadow retreating from fire, and stormed toward the door with his men close behind, their unease palpable as though even they did not know if his rage would follow them into the night. The saloon exhaled when the doors swung shut, conversations sparking again in hushed tones, chairs scraping as patrons dared to move once more, yet she remained still, her heart pounding against her ribs not only with the weight of what had nearly happened, the poison wasted, her vengeance stolen, but with the echo of his stare, the way it had searched her face not with suspicion but with something she could not name, something that unsettled her as much as it drew her nearer to a truth she did not want to face. She had felt his power like a storm pressing against her chest, the raw authority of a man who commanded without question, yet beneath it was the faintest tremor of humanity, of longing, of recognition, and it left her trembling in a way bullets and brawlers never had. As the echoes of his boots faded, she gripped the bar tighter, torn between hatred and something dangerously close to curiosity, aware that the night had left her with more than failure, it had left her with questions, and the weight of a man's gaze that refused to leave her mind. That night stretched endlessly, the saloon gone dark and the lamps snuffed one by one until only the faint glow of the moon slipped through the cracks in the shutters, silvering the tables and leaving her alone with thoughts that spun tighter than any noose. She lay on her narrow bed upstairs, the mattress stiff with years of use, the sheets clutched in restless hands that would not still, and her eyes refused the mercy of sleep, for every time she closed them she saw the glass again, amber liquid trembling in the mayor's grip, her breath held, her pulse hammering as she waited for justice, or vengeance, to strike, only to see it dashed away in a storm of fists and flying chairs, leaving her trembling with fury at fate itself. Yet as her mind replayed the scene, anger burned into something more complicated, twisting with guilt that bit sharper than she expected, for she had been ready to end a life, ready to watch him collapse with poison in his veins, and though she told herself it would have been justice, that her brother's death demanded blood in return, the thought of watching any man choke and fall because of her hand clawed at her heart, leaving her unsure if she was as strong as she believed. She turned on her side, the springs groaning, and pressed her palms to her face, whispering curses into the dark, not only at the mayor but at herself, for being weak enough to hesitate in memory and ruthless enough to try in the first place. Her resolve, which only hours ago had felt like iron, wavered like a flame in a draught, for she knew now that her hands were not immune to shaking, her conscience not immune to bleeding. The quiet pressed in heavier than the din of a crowded saloon, and she found her thoughts straying where she did not want them to, toward the mayor's eyes as they had locked with hers before he stormed out, toward the lines of his face carved deep by years of loss and rule, toward the way his presence filled a room not only with power but with something harder to name, something that unsettled her with its persistence. She hated that her heart quickened at the memory, hated that a part of her wondered what lay beneath the steel of his voice, what kind of man grief and power had shaped him into, hated most of all that her vengeance was not pure, that it was tainted now by doubt and by the unwelcome shadow of curiosity. She rolled onto her back and stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks with her eyes as though they held answers, but none came, only the endless rhythm of her heartbeat echoing the questions she could not silence. Could she truly have killed a man, even one she believed guilty, even one who had taken so much? And if she could not, then what did that mean for the fire she carried, the oath she whispered over her brother's grave? Sleep never came, only the cold realization that her war was not just with the mayor, but with herself, and that betrayal did not always come from others, sometimes it rose from within, from the fragile and treacherous chambers of one's own heart. Dawn crept over the town in slow strokes of pale gold, the sun climbing above rooftops that seemed more weary than welcoming, and as the saloon keeper stood behind her bar polishing glasses she had already cleaned twice over, she felt the kind of tremor in her chest that no amount of routine could quiet, for through the window she saw him coming, the tall figure of the mayor in his early 40s, dark coat brushing against his boots, spurs glinting faintly in the first light, his stride steady as if he had never doubted his place in the world. Her throat tightened, her hands stiffened, and for a moment she nearly fled to the back room, for the memory of the shattered glass haunted her as though he must surely know, as though some whisper of her intent had reached his ear, and every step he took closer to her door was a step closer to judgment. The hinges groaned as the door swung open, the familiar weight of his presence filling the saloon with a silence that pressed against her ribs, and she forced her chin high though her insides churned like a storm, her green eyes fixed on him as he crossed the room with a composure too deliberate to be casual. She searched his expression desperately, looking for accusation, for suspicion, for the cold certainty of a man who knew she had meant to kill him. But instead she found only intensity, a gaze so unwavering it seemed to pierce through her anger and her guilt and into something deeper she did not want to name. And that frightened her more than any threat could have. His face, weathered and lined, carried the weight of loss and responsibility, yet there was no malice in it, only a resolve that unsettled her, as though he had come not to expose her sin but to demand something greater, something she was not ready to give. She gripped the bar to keep her hands from shaking, forcing herself to meet his eyes, every nerve screaming that he had come to test her, to draw from her some confession. Yet when he spoke, his words were steady, almost softer than she expected, carrying none of the fury from the night before, and though his men lingered outside, leaving the room to the two of them, it felt as if the world had shrunk to that single moment, two figures locked in a silence heavy with unspoken truths. She thought of her brother, of the poison wasted, of the restless night spent twisting in guilt, and she braced for confrontation, for accusation, yet what she saw instead was a man stripped of the mask of tyranny, a man whose eyes burned with a need she did not yet understand, and it left her trembling more than the thought of exposure ever could, for she realized then that his power did not only come from fear or authority, it came from his ability to reach into places of her heart she had thought long buried, and she hated that even as she feared him, part of her waited to hear what he would say next. He did not waste time with courtesies or with the hollow words that men so often use to soften the blow of their intentions, for the mayor stood there in the pale wash of dawn, boots planted firm against the floorboards, eyes locked on her with a steadiness that unnerved her, and with a voice that carried neither hesitation nor apology, he spoke the words that froze her heart in place. He wanted her as his wife, no preamble, no sweetened language, no plea disguised as charm. Just a plain truth delivered with the weight of a man who had seen too much loss and had grown accustomed to cutting straight through the noise of life, and for a moment she could not breathe, her hand still gripping the bar as though the polished wood might anchor her in the storm he had unleashed. "Marriage," he said, as though it were not an impossible thought, as though she might simply set aside grief and rage and slip into the role he laid before her, yet his tone carried no arrogance, no assumption of conquest, but something else, something raw and almost pleading hidden beneath the steel. For he was a man in his early 40s, weathered by years of burdens, scarred by the death of a wife buried too soon, and though he bore the armor of authority, this confession was a fracture in it, a glimpse of longing that reached for something pure in a world that had turned to ash around him. Her breath caught, fury and disbelief colliding inside her chest, for how could he, the man she believed guilty of her brother's death, the tyrant who bled her town with taxes and schemes, stand before her and ask not for forgiveness, not for alliance, but for her hand, her life, her heart? She wanted to spit back at him, to laugh in his face or curse him until the rafters shook, yet the intensity in his gaze stripped her of words, leaving only silence that trembled with the clash of hate and something dangerously close to recognition. His presence filled the room like a storm, yet she saw in the lines around his mouth, in the shadows that clung to his eyes, the truth of a man who had been hollowed by loss and who sought in her a chance to reclaim something he feared gone forever, and that made her anger falter, if only for a heartbeat. She turned her face away, hoping distance might steady her, but his words lingered like smoke, curling around her thoughts, suffocating in their simplicity, and she realized that while vengeance had been her anchor, his proposal threatened to unmoor her entirely, dragging her into waters where she could neither trust nor despise without consequence. Rage told her to refuse him, to see in his offer nothing but manipulation, a way to bind her will to his, yet disbelief whispered another truth, that perhaps even a man carved into tyranny might still crave redemption, that perhaps his eyes sought her not as possession but as salvation. Breathless, trembling, caught between the fire of revenge and the pull of something she could not yet name, she stood in silence, aware that her world had just shifted, that the path she thought she owned had been split by a choice she never expected to face. The silence that followed his proposal stretched so long it seemed to bend time itself, the morning light shifting across the saloon floor as dust floated in golden beams, and she stood frozen behind the bar, lips parted but no words rising, for her heart was a battlefield torn between hatred and a betrayal of feelings she did not want to admit, her mind screaming that this was the man who had stolen her brother from her, The man whose taxes starved her town, and yet her body trembled not with rage but with something far more dangerous, an ache stirred by the gentleness hidden in his eyes, an unexpected tenderness that struck her harder than any bullet. Guilt tightened around her like a noose as she remembered the vial tipped into his glass, remembered how near she had come to ending his life, and the thought that he now stood before her, not with suspicion or wrath but with an offer so raw and human, made her chest constrict until she could hardly breathe. She wanted to scream that he was a tyrant, to strike him down with words that would make her father proud, yet when she opened her mouth nothing came, only silence that betrayed the truth of her confusion, that she was shaken in a way she had never been before. He watched her with a stillness that unnerved her, not pressing, not demanding, simply waiting, as though he knew her soul warned against itself and was willing to let the battle play out in her own time. And when no answer came, when she lowered her eyes and gripped the bar until her knuckles whitened, he nodded once, a gesture of understanding that cut her deeper than scorn, then turned without another word, his boots striking softly against the boards as he strode toward the door. She lifted her gaze in time to see the light catch on the silver at his temples, to see the weight he carried in his broad shoulders, and though she had every reason to feel relief at his leaving, what settled in her chest instead was a hollow ache, as if something vital had been pulled from her before it had the chance to take form. The doors swung open, spilling sunlight across the saloon before they creaked shut again. And in the wake of his absence the silence returned heavier than before, pressing against her until she nearly collapsed beneath it, her breath ragged, her thoughts a storm of contradictions. She pressed a trembling hand to her heart as if to steady its wild rhythm, but the truth would not be silenced. She could not answer because she did not know if she hated him enough to refuse or if some fractured part of her had begun, against all reason, to want what he offered. Hope, unwanted and dangerous, lingered in the air like perfume after a dance, clinging to her skin, to her lungs, and she despised it even as she inhaled it, knowing that his departure was not an ending but a door left open, a possibility that haunted her steps long after the echo of his boots faded into the dawn. The storm of doubt gathered in her chest long before the clouds rolled over the horizon, each heartbeat hammering with questions she could not silence, and by the time she saddled her horse the sky itself seemed to echo her turmoil, wind sweeping dust through the hollow streets as though the whole town knew she was about to make a choice that would alter more than her own life. She rode hard, the reins cutting into her palms, her jaw tight as she passed shuttered windows and merchants bent over ledgers they could not balance, every face she glimpsed reminding her of the tyranny she had sworn to resist, and yet every hoofbeat carried her closer to the very man she blamed, because something in his eyes, something in the bare sincerity of his proposal, had rooted itself in her and refused to let go. The ride to the mansion was long enough for her to argue with herself 100 times, for her father's lessons to rise in her memory, for her brother's laughter to haunt her like an echo, and still she pressed on, the ache of indecision twisting into determination not because she had found clarity but because she had grown tired of silence. When at last the mansion appeared on the rise, its stone walls gray against the storm-lit sky, her throat tightened, for it loomed both as a fortress and as a cage, a place that could either protect or consume her, and she wondered if stepping inside would mean betraying the people who looked to her for defiance. She dismounted with trembling hands, her boots crunching on the gravel path as thunder growled overhead, and when the doors opened to reveal him standing there, tall and steady in the dim light of his hall, she nearly faltered, nearly turned back to the saddle, but his gaze, dark, unflinching, heavy with both longing and restrained, held her fast, and the words she had rehearsed scattered like dry leaves in the wind. For a moment they stood without speaking, the silence charged with all that had passed between them, the failed poison, the restless nights, the proposal that still echoed in her ears, and then her lips moved, trembling, reluctant, yet yielding at last to the truth she could not deny. Her voice broke as it left her throat, but the word was clear, fragile yet unshakable, yes. It was not a cry of surrender, not a proclamation of love, but a whispered choice born of confusion and courage, and the sound of it filled the great hall with a resonance she could feel in her bones. His breath caught, though his expression remained steady, and for the first time since she had known him, the weight of his authority seemed to lift, replaced by something tender, almost vulnerable, as though her single word had stripped away the armor of office and left only the man beneath. She stood trembling, caught between relief and terror, knowing she had stepped onto a path with no return, yet also knowing that for the first time in years, she was not walking it alone. The mansion's firelight flickered against stone walls as though the flames themselves carried secrets too long buried, and she stood rigid in the center of his study, her breath caught between defiance and disbelief, when the mayor, steady as the oak desk between them, began to unravel truths she had never imagined hearing. His voice was low, carrying the gravity of confession rather than the thunder of command, and with each word her chest tightened, for he told her that her brother's death had not been born of decree or vengeance, but of recklessness and folly, a tavern brawl gone too far where he himself had tried to intervene, arriving too late to save the young man who had already sealed his fate in blood and fury, and though the mayor's hands had pulled him from the dirt, life had already slipped away, leaving only silence and the crushing weight of helplessness. Her nails bit into her palms as she listened, torn between anger that he dared speak her brother's name and the sinking awareness in his eyes that no lie could mimic, the rawness of a man who carried the memory like a wound he could not close. But before she could speak, he pulled forth ledgers bound in cracked leather, opening them with the precision of a man who knew that paper told truer tales than whispers, and there before her eyes were columns of numbers that contradicted every rumor, every curse she had hurled at his name, for the coins that he siphoned from merchants, the levies that starved families, were traced in careful script to homes of widows, to supplies for orphans, to medicines carried to those who would otherwise have perished in silence. Each page struck her like a hammer, each line a revelation that his tyranny had been a mask, a facade worn to shield the truth of sacrifice, for in a land where generosity was seen as weakness and where charity invited exploitation, he had cloaked his giving in cruelty, taking lashes of hatred upon his back so that others might survive without knowing who had borne their burden. Her knees weakened as she traced the ink, the faces of townsfolk flashing in her mind, children with full bellies, mothers who had found medicine, old men who had roofs patched in winter, and she realized they had been saved by the very hand she sought to poison. Her voice cracked when she demanded why he had hidden it, why he had let the world see him as a monster, and his answer came not with triumph but with weary honesty, that power built on fear was steadier than power built on kindness, and that if his name had to be cursed so others could live, then he would bear it until the grave. She turned from the desk, trembling, her heart in pieces, for the vengeance that had been her anchor now dissolved into dust, leaving her adrift in a sea of truth too heavy to ignore. The man she had sworn to hate stood before her not as a tyrant but as a broken savior, and in his weathered face she saw not cruelty but sacrifice, not malice but love for a town too blind to see it, and though her brother's death still throbbed like an open wound, the edges of her rage began, at last, to soften under the unbearable weight of revelation. The first light of dawn spilled across the frontier like a benediction, turning the dusty streets to rivers of gold and washing the tired town in a warmth it had long forgotten, and as shutters creaked open and merchants stepped into the day with cautious hope, two figures stood together on the saloon's porch, the saloon keeper, her dark hair catching the sun like strands of fire, and the mayor, his weathered face softened in the glow, silver at his temples gleaming as though time itself had chosen to bless him anew, and in their stance side by side there was no trace of the hatred that had once defined them, only the quiet strength of partners who had walked through shadow to find each other in the light. Word of their union had spread like wildfire, and while tongues wagged with disbelief at first, the proof lay in the changes unfolding, taxes eased, not abolished but made fair. Each coin accounted for in the open ledgers the mayor now allowed to rest on the saloon bar where any man could read them. Widows no longer wept alone, for food and blankets arrived at their doors without shame, and children laughed louder in the streets, their games chasing away the ghosts of hunger. The town, once broken and bowed, began to lift its head again. Merchants staring to bargain with smiles, blacksmith hammers ringing not only with work but with pride, and farmers trading grain as if the soil itself had decided to yield more beneath the promise of new leadership. She, once the keeper of her family's legacy and little else, now walked among them not only as a saloon mistress but as a woman whose courage had bridged the unthinkable, her compassion binding wounds as surely as her strength had held chaos at bay, and he, once the tyrant cursed in whispers, stood revealed for what he truly was, a man willing to be hated if it meant his people survived, now finally free to show the heart behind his stern exterior, his authority tempered not by fear but by trust. Yet even in their unity the past lingered, bittersweet as the name itself suggested, for grief cannot be undone by truth alone, and in the quiet moments she still felt her brother's absence like a missing note in a song, while he bore the weight of choices that had cost him years of solitude. But they carried that sorrow together, their losses shaping them into something stronger than either could have been alone. On that sunrise morning, as wind stirred the banners above the street and the sky blazed from violet to gold, they looked upon the town with the solemn joy of survivors who had chosen to build rather than destroy, and in their clasped hands, rough and scarred, rested the fragile hope of a frontier no longer ruled by shadows but by the steady promise of light, rising higher with every passing hour.